Hey everybody, this is Mike with Freeroaming Photography, and in this video I'm going to run through 16 of my favorite images from the spring of 2024. And along the way, I'm going to be giving you tips about how I shot each one, what I wish I had done better or differently, and why each image was one of my favorites. And just before we get going, just a quick reminder that I do offer private photography workshops both in Grand Teton and Yellowstone National Parks. So if that's something you're interested in and coming out and learning in the field with wildlife, nature, all kinds of things out here, check out the link in the description and we'll get you booked up and ready to go. And so with that out of the way, let's dig in. Now I did this for the winter, and I defined the winter as November 15th through April 15th, just because that's roughly the winter here in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. So similarly, I'm going to define the spring season as April 16th through June 15th. That's typically our most spring-like conditions, and likewise when all these shots were taken. And for this first image, spring also means birding migration. And so we were getting a lot of early visitors, and one of the rarities we get in Grand Teton National Park is a white-faced ibis. And I was out looking to see which birds had come in, and I was on my way back home, and I noticed this odd-shaped bird kind of wandering around along the shore. And this was just before sunrise. The sun hadn't quite yet come up yet. So I stopped, I got out, and I began photographing this bird, mostly silhouettes at the time, unless it was in a different situation. And as it was walking around the shore out to this little peninsula of the spring, that's when the sun came up. It hit it beautifully, amazing lighting right along the shore of the spring. I mean, you couldn't really ask for a better condition with this white-faced ibis. It was just a beautiful shot. Definitely one of my favorites. And everything was just working in favor for this image. So it came together beautifully, was a really fun time photographing it, and obviously I'm happy with it. And given that there's not really anything I'd change, I couldn't have asked for a better situation. And so for the settings, I had the ISO at 1000 and had my aperture at f8, and the shutter speed I got from that was 1/2500th of a second. Of course, that changed through the course of when I was shooting it because, as I mentioned, the sun was still below the horizon, and so there wasn't a lot of direct light hitting it until this particular shot. So as that moment came up, I was changing a lot of my settings, bringing down the ISO, which didn't need to be as high once the sun came up, and once the sun did come up, was able to find some more balanced settings. So again, spring migration. I was at the National Elk Refuge seeing if any new birds had come up, and sure enough, the yellow-headed blackbirds had come up. And this was a particularly moody day, hence the gray background, but I found that this yellow-headed blackbird created such striking contrast against the grays, and I really loved those sort of brownish, reddish, dead leaves on the branches that it was perched on. And because it was looking up, I just thought with the branches, it just made this really nice vertical composition. It looking up through the frame with the branches as the branches kind of go up through, and that muted background really helped to pop out both the leaves and the bird itself. My only grudge against this image is that there's a lot of loose branches kind of coming in from the bottom. I'd like that bottom to be a little bit cleaner, but I mean, a lot of times you take what you can get. I could use AI and cloning and probably get rid of that, but it's really not worth it. I really don't want to detract that much from the image. If there's a stray branch or something, I might go ahead and remove it. I'm not against like a stray blade of grass, getting rid of that. That can certainly make a big difference, but I kind of draw the line at removing too many things. Eventually you just start manipulating the image beyond what was there. And that's kind of where I draw the line. I don't have a problem with one or two branches or blades of grass or something like that, but too many starts to just sort of alter what was there initially and changing the whole composition. But still, I thought this image came out great, really loved it, and was really happy with the way it came out. So for the settings on this one, I had the ISO at 2500, my aperture was at f8, and my exposure was 1/2000th of a second. I had the shutter speed at that high just in case it was going to fly around and move around quickly. I wanted to make sure it freezes that action because with birds, you want that quick shutter speed to make sure you freeze any wing movements or flying or even just moving their heads around because they move quickly. So same day, just a little bit later in the morning, I was walking around some more and there was a lot of reed grasses and I captured this song sparrow flying away from some of the dead ones from the previous season. And for me, this really captures how pretty song sparrows can be. A lot of people overlook them, don't give them a second thought. They just think they're just a little brown bird. But this shot in particular really captures how vibrant they can be and how colorful they are, especially with their wings spread out. Plus, it's a great action scene. You can tell it's flying away. You can tell the wings are outstretched. It's really doing something interesting. And for me, that sells it. In terms of what I might have wanted differently, I would have liked to have had those wings a little bit more crisp. I was using a fast shutter speed, but this is a very small bird, and the smaller the bird, the faster they move. And that shutter speed wasn't quite fast enough to capture the action and freeze the wings. You can tell they're just a little bit blurred. And for this, it still kind of works, but me personally, I would have wanted to see those wings frozen in action, to see them a little bit crisper with a little bit more definition versus the blurred look. And that shutter speed in question was 1/2000th of a second. So even though I did have it really fast, it still wasn't fast enough to capture a bird this small with its wings in motion. So definitely with small birds especially, keep that shutter speed high. Obviously, I would have wanted it higher, faster. So case in point. The other two settings, I had the ISO at 2500 and the aperture at f8. And because I was at f8, I would probably want to compensate by going down to f4 to give me back some of that available light to use for shutter speed. The next image shows that spring migration isn't just for the birds. Here in Jackson Hole, we get a massive elk migration with about 9 or 10,000 elk heading north out of the National Elk Refuge. And once they do that, they are all over Antelope Flats. And that's what this image shows. You had a big herd in the background with one or two kind of in the foreground, which really helped to kind of define and give clarity to the larger herd in the background. A lot of painters will use this trick. They'll show a large herd in the background and they'll show one or two up close to kind of give you an idea of what that animal is and what it represents in terms of the larger herd in the background. And this occasionally works out photographically in real life. And that's what's going on here. This big elk herd was migrating out of the refuge. They were on Antelope Flats. It was a really moody and stormy morning with some light breaking through and kind of hitting the elk in the mountains. And I just thought it made for a really beautiful composition. It really captures the elk migrating through Jackson Hole. Now, the settings for this, because I wanted to capture a lot of depth, I had my aperture stopped down to f16 to preserve a lot of the depth between the elk and the mountains and even the foreground grasses and sagebrush. And because there wasn't a whole lot of movement going, I only had my shutter speed at 1/60th of a second. There wasn't a lot of action. There wasn't a lot of movement. As long as those elk were holding still, I would get them, and it wouldn't really affect the background elk because they were much farther away. And then my ISO was at 320. And because this was right at sunrise, I could have pushed that ISO up just a little bit more and give me more shutter speed, but it didn't really affect anything. There wasn't a whole lot going on, so it still works out. Now, one bird I've always wanted to get a good shot of is a northern harrier. And I was up in the northern part of the park seeing if any spring migrating birds had gotten up there yet when I came across this northern harrier flying over Willow Flats in Grand Teton National Park. And luckily, this one just wasn't shy. I was able to watch it and follow it and photograph it, and I got some great shots, and this one especially was the kind of shot I've always wanted from a northern harrier. It came out beautifully. It's hunting. It's looking around. It makes for a great portrait. The wings are outstretched. Everything's crisp and frozen and didn't get the blurred effect by using too slow of a shutter speed, so was really happy with this one. There's also some really nice lighting hitting it, which makes it even a more powerful portrait. So didn't need to crank up the settings too much for this one. This was at ISO 1600 at f8 with 1/3200th of a second. That was plenty enough shutter speed to freeze the bird, especially because it's a larger bird, so it's not flapping its wings as rapidly as that song sparrow, for example. So 1/3200th of a second was plenty, and it worked out great. So just down the road, I was at the Jackson Lake Dam area, and I was checking there to see which migratory birds had come up, and sure enough, some tree swallows had, and they were all over the Snake River. There was probably at least 100 of them just flying up and down the Snake River where it comes out of the Jackson Lake Dam, catching all the early mosquitoes and gnats that were already on the river. And just like the northern harrier, this is another one that I'd always wanted to get in flight. A good shot of a swallow in flight, hunting right above the water or somewhere else similar. And this one just came out beautifully. I got a lot of good shots of the swallows in flight, and this one was my favorite. In this shot, I even managed to capture two. Somehow the one behind it was in the shade while the one in foreground with all the action around it was lit up, which worked out beautifully. I don't remember how that happened, but it's just nice when things work out like that. And it had just gone down to the water, creating this big splash as it impacted with the surface, catching whatever bug it was after, and it created this beautiful composition. It's trying to get back up from the water while the water's splashing around it. The one behind it is obviously part of the action, and it just created this really fun and dynamic composition, and was a beautiful shot and the kind I'd been wanting to get of swallows. And because they are swallows, they're very fast. Their movement is very quick. So I knew I wanted a really fast shutter speed. So I was shooting at 1/4000th of a second at f8 with an ISO of 3200. And that ISO, it's cranked up a little bit, but not a lot by today's standards with modern cameras. So that really helped to get me that 1/4000th of a second to really freeze that action. And with small birds like that, freezing the action is vital. Because you could probably tell if I hadn't frozen it as much, the water would have been more blurred, their wings would have been more blurred, and it just wouldn't come out as crisp or as interesting had that happened. Now, a lot of red-winged blackbirds stay here, but of course during the spring, they're displaying a lot more. And when they do that, they're showing off a lot of that red in their wings a lot more, and it becomes a lot more vibrant and a lot more noticeable. And that's something I'd also wanted to capture. And this shot perfectly does it. It's exactly the kind of red-winged blackbird shot I was looking for, with their colors all flared out, really on display, with the bird calling. It's just a really beautiful red-winged blackbird shot on the end of a cattail, and really captures the intensity and the drama of that moment that they put into it. So for this one, I was at ISO 1600 at f8 with 1/2000th of a second. So I was prepared to get it flying, but in this case, it wasn't moving a whole lot, but that shutter speed still helped to capture the action of its beak opening up and closing, the feathers moving. So this came out really well. The settings were dialed in perfectly. I'm really happy with that one. So the next one, everybody is going to remember May 11th of 2024. That was the day we had a massive solar storm and the northern lights were photographed as far south as Florida. Now, I had already been planning on taking my daughter camping that night before I even knew the northern lights were going to be out, which I'm usually checking well in advance. So I wanted to take her camping, but when I saw the northern lights were going to be out, I wanted to make sure we had a good northern view. I was driving out to an area east of Jackson Hole, which would have that, because a lot of places were still closed. It was early May. That's still very early in the season here, so a lot of campgrounds were still closed. So I'm driving by one campground on our way to where I want to be, and my daughter, 4 years old, starts shouting out that she wanted to camp down there. I tried to ask her, like, let's keep going, it's gonna be prettier. She's like, no, I really want to camp down there. So reluctantly, we camped down there. It didn't have a great northern view, so I wasn't too excited about it, but I knew it was going to be good, so I set something up anyway before we went to bed. I set up time lapses so my camera would get a whole bunch of stuff. And I also made sure to get a campsite right down on the lake. We were camped at Slide Lake in the Gros Ventre Mountains. I wanted a shot along the lake shore. Fortunately, one was still available. So I at least had that where I could walk down, get a shot with the lake reflecting the northern lights and the water, set up the time lapses, and a little disappointed I didn't have a northern view. I just went to bed with them going. And I let them go until the batteries run out. So this shot was probably my favorite of what I managed to get. And with the compositions I had available, this was probably the best I was going to get. But this really showed off the intensity of the northern lights above the Jackson Hole area, with northern lights streaking down. And this is, by the way, looking west, not north or anything like that. So this really captures just how bright and vivid they were. And I mentioned this in a previous video, which you can check out here, but with northern light shots, you really don't want to exceed 5 or 6 seconds because that will blur together the ribbons, so you don't get that really crisp shot of the ribbon streaking through the sky. Instead, the colors will just kind of blur together. So this shot, the shutter speed was 5 seconds, and my ISO is at 4000 with an aperture of 2.8. And because of the northern lights were so bright, they're also creating their own light. So it's not like a dark night sky shot. The sky was lit up. So those settings didn't need to be jacked up like you would normally do for normal Milky Way shots, for example. So the very next night, I was out trying to get the northern lights again. They were strong enough so that there would definitely be some activity. Likely wouldn't going to be as strong, and I knew that going into it. But with this opportunity, I had a chance to set up again with the kind of shots that I was hoping to get the night before. And for this, I drove out on Antelope Flat, so I had a nice big view to the north. I found some nice foreground elements, a creek running through, heading back into the Tetons, and managed to get some bright, vivid colors. And this was taken with a 30mm lens, so it was kind of zoomed in a little bit more. And because of that, I wanted to keep my shutter speed relatively quick. Again, as I mentioned, with northern lights, you don't want a really long shutter speed because all those things will be blurred together. The more zoomed in you are, the more that is applicable. So for this shot, I had my shutter speed down to 2 seconds with an aperture of 2.2 at ISO 8000. So I had to crank up that ISO to get that really quick shutter speed. And on this particular lens, I really don't like going down to 2.2. With a lot of lenses, you start to get some distortion around the edges. And 2.2 is about the limit that I would go for this particular lens. It can go down to 1.8, but I don't like going down that far, pushing the lens's capabilities, because that's when you start to see a little bit of distortion around the edges, and I was trying to prevent that. So in sticking with the night photography theme, just a few days later, I was picking somebody up for a sunrise workshop, and I like to give myself a little bit of time. I like to be early, even that early in the morning. And so I was driving by along the Moose Wilson Road, which had recently opened, and stopped at a pond, which I've driven by a million times. Usually don't see too much there, but it's a pretty pond along the northern end of the Moose Wilson Road, and realized I had some time to play with. I was going to be there pretty soon. There wasn't a lot that could slow me down between where I was and where I was picking them up in Teton Village. And so I stopped at this pond and found this really great Milky Way shot. Now, the first light of day was just coming up on the opposite horizon. This is kind of looking southish, and the sun was already pretty far to the north. So it was kind of coming up on the northeastern-ish horizon. So there was just this first light coming in way back there. So you get that little hint of blue in this night sky, which added a nice little bit of color. And then, of course, you get the light pollution coming down from Jackson right below the Milky Way, where it converges down onto the horizon. But just the stillness of the pond, the composition, it worked out really well. Probably one of my favorite shots I've ever gotten from this area, and just a beautifully colored image thanks to just getting it right at the crack of dawn. So this was at ISO 6400 for 25 seconds with an aperture of 2.8. Now, opposite the northern light shots with a normal night sky exposure like the Milky Way, I wanted that 25 seconds because there's not a lot of action to freeze like there is with ribbons of northern lights. So that 25 seconds was A, long enough to absorb all the light coming in from the stars in the Milky Way, but then B, it was quick enough so that it didn't catch the stars moving. A lot of people like to do star trail photography. In the old days of film, you wanted to leave it open as long as you could, but these days, it's a lot better to take a series of images and stack them together. You get much better results doing that, and that's a whole different subject for another video. In this case, I was on 14 millimeters, so on a full frame sensor. So that 20 to 30 second exposure time is a perfect balance to get the stars in focus, crisp, not moving too quickly through the frame, and then also absorbing enough light to create a nice image of the night sky. So this image was taken at the north entrance of Yellowstone National Park, and this is the famous Roosevelt Arch, which I had driven by many, many times. I was up there because I had a workshop I was doing the next day. I got up there a day early to do some hiking and enjoying the park, and I was driving out of the north entrance to where I was staying, and there just happened to be this incredible rainbow after this shower had passed through. And the rainbow arched beautifully down to the arch. And fortunately, having seen this scene being set up, there were not a lot of people there. I was the first one there, so I had it to myself. So there weren't a lot of cars or people moving around that I had to work around, which did happen a few minutes later. But the rainbow was at its brightest here. It worked perfectly with the composition of the arch, kind of leading your eye down to it and really showing off the majesty of the arch. It's such a beautiful arch. I've never been able to get a good shot until this one, just because I feel like it needed that extra element, which the weather was happy to provide. Now, because the arch was close up and the mountains in the distance were also far away, I wanted to preserve that depth. So I shot my aperture at f/16 with an ISO of 500, which gave me an aperture of 1/200th of a second. And I wanted something quick enough that I could handhold with my general mid-range wide-angle lens, because I knew I'd be moving around trying to find different compositions, so I didn't want to be dealing with my tripod, because in situations like this where there's a rainbow, light's changing really fast, things are changing really fast, the intensity of the rainbow's moving, and then I knew people would be coming up. I didn't want to be fumbling around with my tripod, so I just wanted to handhold and move around so I could move a little bit more dynamically. And a 1/200th of a shutter speed is plenty with a wide-angle lens or even a mid-range lens. So that gave me the opportunity to just kind of move around more freely. Now, serendipity must have been on my side for that little Yellowstone trip, because after the workshop, I was on my way back, and who did I bump into but 399 and her cub. And it was such a great experience because I was just driving down the road, and I was maybe the third car there, just happened to be there as she just popped right out of the woods with her cub, and they were just grazing right along the roadside. It was a great encounter. Got a lot of nice close-up shots of them, but this one was probably my favorite, just because even though 399 is in the shot, and even though she is the star of the show, it really kind of isolates in on her cub. I got her yearling cub in focus in this one. It beautifully captures that catch light in the cub's eyes as it's kind of gazing toward its mother. And not to try to anthropomorphize, but it's pretty easy to do when you have a cub looking at its mother. You can kind of see it's thinking about something for sure. They're smart animals. They have a thought process. So what it's thinking, we'll never know. But with an expression like that, it's easy to anthropomorphize, which makes it a little bit more accessible. And those eyes kind of create a connection between us and the bears. And through the cub looking at its mother, we create a connection with both bears. So total serendipitous encounter. Had no idea she was going to be there, but it worked out beautifully. Really happy with it. Really fun, beautiful shot of the bears. And because they're large mammals, I didn't need a shutter speed as fast as I would with birds. So the shutter speed for this one was 1/1250th of a second, and that was at aperture f8 with an ISO of 2500. And I wanted f8 because these are larger animals. With f4, there's more room for error in where you focus, and if you miss even a little bit, you catch the nose or some fur around the eye, then that eye is going to be out of focus. And with a shot, especially where the eyes are so important, like this one, you really want to make sure you got the eyes in focus. So I was at f8 to preserve more depth within the face of that cub. So just a bit later in the spring, I was hiking around some of the trails that extend out from Eastern Jackson and came across this mountain chickadee in the trail. Not very shy and very willing to let me take its shot. But what makes it so much fun is that it's doing more behavior than just standing on a perch or just standing in the trail. Now, I had hiked this trail a couple of weeks prior, and I can't remember if this was something like wolf scat or part of a carcass that had gotten taken down in that part of the trail. But I remember there was some kind of remnant of an animal in that trail, and by this time it had broken down into just some loose debris and fur, and the chickadee was picking it apart and keeping some for its nest. So it was actually eating bits of it that it would regurgitate at its nest. And so this just turned out to be a great portrait of it picking up some of that with its beak and stuffing it into its mouth. And I was able to get close enough that I didn't alter its behavior. I definitely didn't want to do that. So this made for a great portrait of it actually doing something other than just sitting there. So this was a cloudy day. It wasn't so cloudy that I didn't want to be using my 2x multiplier, which I sometimes use for small birds. So I had that on, but because this was in a more shaded area, it created a little bit of extra shade. So I did have to crank up the ISO in this case to 6400, which gave me the aperture of f8 with a shutter speed of 1/1600th of a second. And in this case, it's enough to stop the action. It wasn't flying, it wasn't flapping its wings. It was just pecking at the debris and putting it in its mouth. So while yes, with a bird this small, you want a fast shutter speed. In this case, I got away with a little bit slower because it wasn't doing anything super quick. So a bit later in the spring, as green grasses began to grow, more birds came migrating in. I drove out on the National Elk Refuge to see if there were any birds out that way and managed to find this horned lark, which posed beautifully on this rock against the green grass, created a really stunning, colorful composition, which I really liked, and a little bit of rain. There's just kind of drizzling in the background, so I get a little bit of that too. And the grasses in this case even work in my favor as you get that one on the left side pointing back to the lark, so you create this nice circular composition through the image. My only complaint with this, it's pretty minor, but this rock had obviously been used by birds previously, as evidenced by the bird poop underneath the horned lark. Not a major drawback, but depends on how off-put you may or may not be by that. But the light rain and the moisture in the air really helped to pop the colors in this image, which works out really well with a lot of the relatively drabber birds. I don't think this bird's too drab, but that brown is common, but it has a lot of nice accents on the wings, and the clouds and the wetness and the rain in the air helped to pop that out a little bit more. So for this, the settings I had were ISO 3200 at f8 with 1/1600th of a second. And because I was so close and zoomed in, it was going to be hard to capture those wings actually spreading apart if I did manage to catch it flying. So I wasn't overly concerned with that fast of a shutter speed in this specific scenario. In this case, I was more focused on just the perch and the pose of the bird itself, because I knew if it flapped its wings, it was going to be way out of the frame. And for me personally, I like including the wings within the frame. So on the same morning, I was still driving around, seeing a lot of good birds, and this one in particular really caught my eye. I didn't know what it was at the time because it's pretty rare for this area, but I was delighted to find out that it's an American pipit, which A, was a new lifer for me, but then B, is just another rare bird that was passing through the area. Now, despite the similarity to the last one, this is not the same rock. This is a totally different spot, but you can see we had a little bit more rain. The grasses are a little bit more wet. And again, the overcast light really helps to pop out the bird's colors, and that diffused light from the sun, it really creates great wildlife photography. And then the little droplets on the grasses also help to create a little bit extra character to the image. So I really like this image, not just because it's a rare bird, but also it's just a beautiful portrait of that bird as well. And very similar to the last one, ISO of 3200, 1/1600th of a second with an f8 aperture. Didn't really get it flying, but with a portrait like that, I'm okay with that. And then finally, the last one, I was hiking south of Jackson and managed to catch a Bullock's oriole perched in the trees. And I really love the way the oriole's colors pop out from the background. You got the kind of grayish branches with a bold green background, and that really creates a nice contrast between the subject and the background. And for me, there's a few too many branches. I would have liked to have seen a few less branches ideally, but you just kind of take what you can get. And it still works because the branches are subdued. They're not very distracting in terms of color. So the focus still really remains on that oriole and the green in the background much farther back. So for this one, this was at ISO 1000 at f8 with 1/1600th of a second. And this is a larger bird, so had I gotten it flying, it might have come out in focus. But again, for birds, that was a pretty slow shutter speed, and it really would have been dependent on when that frame captured the bird's wings moving, if it would have come out in focus or not. So those are all 16. If you had any questions or comments about any of them, any details that I left out, leave them down in the comments below, and you can also let me know which one's your favorite, if you have any. And if you want to check out those workshops, look for the link in the description, and please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this. It helps me out a lot. I can keep the content coming, and thank you for watching, and happy trails.